Hey there, and welcome. Today we are digging into one of history's most creative and, frankly, messiest systems for running a country, feudalism. It was this really clever solution for managing a huge and chaotic medieval Europe, especially when a king just couldn't do it all by himself. So, to really get it, let's first understand the massive problem these kings were staring down.
Right, so to figure out why feudalism was even a thing, you gotta picture Europe in the early Middle Ages. The Roman Empire had just crumbled, and with it, any kind of central control. It just evaporated. And that left kings with a truly massive headache.
So, I want you to put yourself in the king's shoes for a second. You are in charge of this gigantic territory. You've got to collect taxes, you've got to defend your borders, you have to keep the peace. But there's one huge problem. How on earth are you supposed to manage all of that by yourself?
And you have to remember, this isn't our modern world with highways and high-speed internet. Medieval Europe was this vast, mostly empty place. It was just filled with wild forests, swamps, and very, very few reliable roads that connected these tiny, isolated villages. Just getting a message from one end of your kingdom to the other, that could take weeks.
Okay, so a king can't be everywhere at once, right? He needed a practical solution, and that solution was feudalism. This wasn't some grand political theory that somebody dreamed up in a library. It was a down-to-earth, pragmatic answer to an absolutely overwhelming problem.
There's this old Dutch saying that just nails the core idea. It basically means if the job is too big for one person, you delegate. And that is exactly what kings like Charlemagne did. They decided to share the burden of ruling.
And this whole system created two key roles. First, you had the lord, or leenheer, who was the one granting the land. Usually this was the king. Then you had the vassal, or leanman. He was a loyal nobleman, a warrior, who received a piece of that land, called a fief, in exchange for his loyalty.
Now, this wasn't some casual handshake deal. Oh no. It was a formal, totally binding contract, and it was sealed with a very solemn oath of loyalty. Both sides had really specific things they had to do for each other. The crucial point here is, this was a two-way street.
So the core of the deal was pretty simple. The vassal owed his lord rod and dod, which means counsel and action. Counsel meant giving the king advice, especially in wartime. Action meant, well, grabbing your sword and fighting for him. And in return, the lord's job was to give him the land and, most importantly, to protect his vassal from any attacks.
Now here's a really key detail. The original idea, the plan, was that the fief was a loan, not a gift. So when the vassal died, the land was supposed to go right back to the king. Then he could give it to a new, loyal warrior. But, as we're about to see, in theory and in practice, turned out to be two very different things.
And this is where the cracks start to show. This system, which was designed to hold the kingdom together, actually had some unintended consequences that started to pull it apart. The solution began to create its own set of pretty serious problems.
So what happened was, a really powerful vassal with a huge chunk of land would start to think, hey, if the king can do it, why can't I? So they would divide up their land and give it to their own vassals, who were called sub-vassals. This created this really complex pyramid of loyalty, where a knight's main allegiance might be to his local lord, not the king way off in the distance.
And this led to a whole cascade of issues. The king's actual power got weaker and weaker as those fiefs started getting passed down from father to son, basically becoming hereditary. And there was very little the king could do about it. The kingdom fractured into this patchwork of semi-independent territories, and pretty soon the king was completely dependent on his powerful vassals to fight any of his wars. You can actually see this decline reflected in the nicknames of the kings who came after the great Charlemagne. You get guys like Louis the Pious, Charles the Bald, and Louis the Stammerer. I mean, these are not exactly names that inspire fear and respect, right? They really show how much the power of the crown was fading. So, after all that, what are the big things we need to remember about this whole system? Let's quickly recap the most important points to make sure we've got it locked in.
Now, the kings weren't totally helpless, and they did come up with a pretty clever workaround. They started granting huge tracts of land to bishops and other high-ranking clergy. Why? Well, it's simple. Clergy weren't allowed to get married or have kids. So when a bishop died, there was no son to inherit the land. It just automatically went right back to the king. A brilliant move, really.
And just so we're all on the same page, you might hear a few different terms for this. Whether it's called the fief system, feudality, or the feudal system, yep, they all refer to the exact same structure of lords, vassals, and land being granted in exchange for loyalty and military service.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. At the end of the day, feudalism was a trade-off. Vassals give up a huge amount of freedom, but they got land and protection in return. And it leaves us with a question that echoes all the way from the medieval battlefield to our modern world. Is absolute loyalty in exchange for security ever a truly fair deal? Thanks for joining us for this explainer. If you found this useful, you know what to do. Be sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment with your thoughts below. We'll see you next time.